Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name is Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about whether or not the judgment in AD 70 was a type or a foreshadow of an even greater event at the end of the world. Many Christians believe that's the case, but are they right? Okay, to start with, if you're not familiar with the term types and shadows, a type or a shadow, I guess, points forward to or foreshadows an even greater event or person or reality. And once that greater event or reality appears, which is called the antitype, then the type or shadow loses its significance. Now, let me give you some examples of this. Okay, physical circumcision, which was part of the Old Covenant, was a type or shadow of the greater spiritual circumcision of the heart. And you can read this in Colossians 2, verse 11. The Sabbath, which consisted of resting from your labor, one day a week from Friday night to Saturday night, basically. That Sabbath rest was a type or shadow of the ultimate rest in Christ because of forgiveness of sin. And you can read this in Hebrews 3 verse 7 through Hebrews 4 verse 16. Another example, the annual Passover sacrifice of the lamb was a type or shadow of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And you can read this in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. A couple more examples. The physical temple was a type or shadow of the greater spiritual temple. The physical city of Jerusalem was a type or shadow of the greater heavenly Jerusalem. In fact, all the ceremonial aspects of the Old Covenant were types and shadows of the better New Covenant realities. And you can read this in Hebrews 10, verse 1. The Old Covenant types and shadows pointed forward to or foreshadowed the greater New Covenant realities. And once the greater New Covenant realities came, then the types and shadows lost their significance. That's why we today, as Christians, don't have to adhere to the, physical circumcision requirements, so we don't have to keep the Sabbath, we don't have to keep the dietary laws or any of the other ceremonial or civil aspects of the Old Covenant or the law. These were types and shadows that pointed forward to the New Covenant realities, and when the New Covenant realities came, then the types and shadows passed away. And by the way, all these ceremonial aspects of the Old Covenant, they pointed forward to Christ, so Christ fulfilled all these. That's why, they're no longer applicable to Christians. Okay, so is this what the judgment in AD 70 was? A type or shadow of an even greater judgment at the end of the world? Not according to Jesus and the apostles, and I'm going to give some examples. First, there is not a single verse in the New Testament, or the Old Testament for that matter, that says the judgment in AD 70 would be a type or shadow of an even greater judgment. In other words, there's zero scriptural evidence for that view. Point 2, Jesus specifically said that the judgment that would happen within a generation, which did in fact happen by the year AD 70, would be the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be. Here's what Jesus actually said. Here are Jesus' exact words. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. Then they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of glory. And then Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. This is Matthew 24, verses 19 to 34. I skipped a couple of verses in between there, just for time's sake. So, Jesus explicitly said that the judgment in AD 70, which was fulfilled, he said it would happen within a generation, but it was fulfilled in AD 70. Jesus specifically said this judgment would be the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be. Nothing Jesus said suggests in any way that this would be a type or shadow of an even greater judgment. Just the opposite. Okay, point 3. Jesus said his coming in AD 70 would be the time when, quote, each would be rewarded according to his works, end quote. And I'm going to read the passage. It's from Matthew 16, verses 27 to 28, Jesus said, quote, "For the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels to establish his kingdom, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death or die," that's what taste death means, "till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Again, this is Matthew 16, verse 27 to 28. So Jesus' coming in AD 70 would be when, quote, "each was rewarded according to his works." This is referring to the great white throne judgment in Revelation. Compare what Jesus said when he said, God will reward each according to his works. Compare that with what Revelation says, or what John says in Revelation. Here's what John said, quote, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God. The books were open, and another book was open, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged each according to their works," or each according to his works. This is Revelation 20, verses 11 to 14. So this is the same rewarding according to his works that Jesus talked about in Matthew 16. And remember, Jesus said this would happen before his audience passed away. And Revelation, when it was written in around AD 65, said it would happen soon, for the time is near. And you can read this in Revelation 22, verses 6 to 10. So both give the exact same, time indicator, time reference, that it would happen by about AD 70. So that's when this event happened, in AD 70. So this event, this judgment, was no type or shadow. This was the great white throne judgment prophesied in Revelation. Point 4. Consider some of the telling statements that Jesus' apostles uttered about this time period that they were living in the first century. In approximately the year AD 57, Paul said, quote, "Now all these things happened to them," and he's referring to the Israelites in Moses' day. So now all these things happened to them, the Israelites, as examples, and they were written for our admonition. He's talking about the Christians in, Paul's day, "upon whom the end of the ages have come." And this is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. So Paul said that the end of the ages had come when he wrote this passage in approximately AD 57. Now, Peter said in approximately AD 61, quote, "All the prophets from Samuel and those who follow, as many as have spoken, have also foretold these days." This is Acts 3, verse 24. So note, Peter was referring to his days in the first century. Peter's point was that all the Old Testament prophets spoke about, prophesied about, and longed for, to see the days of Peter, so to see the days to see the events that were taking place in the first century, because it would be the time of the Messiah and the time of salvation. Now, keep in mind, it would also be the time of judgment for God's enemies, but for God's people, it would be the time of salvation and eternal life. Sin and separation from God will have finally been restored. That's why all the prophets from Samuel and those who follow foretold these days in the first century, because they all foretold the days of Messiah. And let's see, now another example, in approximately AD 63, Peter said, "The end of all things is at hand." This is 1 Peter 4:7. Once again, this passage does not suggest that the events in AD 70 would be a type or shadow of an even greater event. I mean, Peter said, "The end of all things is at hand." How much clearer can you be? Peter also said, quote, "Jesus is ready to judge the living and the dead. The time has come for judgment to begin." This is 1 Peter 4, verses 5 and verse 17. This once again is talking about the great white throne judgment that Revelation talked about, which I just read. The living and the dead would be judged, just like Revelation said, and just like Peter said here. Then in AD 65, John said, quote, "It is the last hour." So by this time, when John said this in approximately AD 65, it was not even just the last day anymore, it was the last hour of the last day. So these passages are not describing types and shadows. They were describing final realities. And these realities were on the verge of fulfillment when the New Testament was being written. In fact, let me focus in on one of the statements I just read, which was spoken by Paul in approximately AD 57. This is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. I already read this, but I'm going to read it again. It says, now all these things happened to them, and he's talking about the Israelites in Moses' day, as examples, and they were written for our admonition, the Christians in Paul's day, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Okay, so now the Greek word for examples in this passage is typikos, which means types, like types and shadows. In other words, the Israelites in Moses' day were types of the Christians in Paul's day. And the Christians were the antitype, or the fulfillment, the greater reality. And then Paul adds, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Now, the Greek word here, when Paul says the ends of the ages have come, the Greek word for end is tele or telos, which can mean goal. In other words, Paul was saying that the goal of the ages had arrived. So AD 70 was no type or shadow. It was the antitype or the greater reality. So this was no type or AD 70 was no type or shadow, the events of AD 70. Okay, point 5. The judgment foretold in the New Testament would happen at the end of the Old Covenant age, not the end of the New Covenant age. We can be 100% certain of this because the New Covenant age has no end. In, Hebrews 13 verse 20 says, quote, now may the God of peace, who brought up our Lord Jesus from the dead, that great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting new covenant. So this is Hebrews 13 verse 20, by the way. So Hebrews says, it talks about an everlasting new covenant. You can also read this in Jeremiah 32 verse 40 or Isaiah 61 verse 8. All three verses talk about the new covenant as being everlasting. So since the new covenant age has no end, there cannot possibly be a judgment at the end of it, right? Logically. The judgment had to happen at the end of the old covenant age when, the temple was destroyed. In fact, the temple symbolized the old covenant age. You can read this in Hebrews 9 verses 8 and 9. So when the temple fell, it symbolized that the old covenant age had finally come to an end. So that, when the temple fell, that was the judgment. The judgment does not happen at the end of the new covenant age because the new covenant age is everlasting. It happens at the end of the old covenant age. So all these events of AD 70 that the New Testament talks about, they were no type or shadow. They were what the Old Testament prophets all longed to see. It was the judgment of God's enemies and the rewarding or the salvation of God's people. Now, I'm going to answer some possible objections to this that people sometimes bring up. Objection number 1, doesn't the Bible describe a cataclysmic judgment at the end of the world? In fact, the King James Version of the Olivet Discourse, So the King James Version of the Olivet Discourse, in that passage, the disciples ask, quote, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? This is Matthew 24, verse 3. So as this passage says, the disciples ask about the judgment at the end of the world. My response is this. It's true that the King James Version says end of the world in Matthew 24, verse 3. However, a better translation of the Greek word aionios, which is translated world in this passage, is age. In fact, in newer Bible translations, even the New King James Version translates it just that way. It says, quote, tell us when will these things be and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Again, this is Matthew 24, verse 3. So the disciples were asking about the end of the age, not the end of the world. Specifically, they were asking about the end of the Old Covenant age. They were asking when it would end. Here's further proof of this, by the way. Even the King James Version itself says, quote, unto him be glory in the church of Jesus Christ throughout all ages, world without end, end quote. And this is Ephesians 3, verse 21. So even even the King James Version itself says the world does not end. It says world without end. Although technically this passage too should be translated age without end, because it's using that same Greek word ionos. So the new covenant age has no end. So the judgment must have happened at the end of the old covenant age, not the end of the new covenant age. Okay, objection 2. What about all the apocalyptic end of the world sounding descriptions associated with the second coming? For example, Jesus said he would come on clouds, and the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will not give their light. And you can read about this in Matthew 24, verses 29 to 30. You know, a lot of people read this and they say, well, I mean, this just sounds so apocalyptic, like it's talking about the end of the world. My response is this: the exact same kind of apocalyptic language was used to describe previous judgments in the Old Testament, yet it never equated to the end of the world. For example, let's see, regarding the sun, moon, and stars growing dim, here's a passage from the Old Testament that was fulfilled in approximately 500 BC. Isaiah 13, verses 9 to 19, it says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He will destroy the sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Therefore, I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of its place. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." End quote. So as this passage itself says, this was a prophecy about the judgment of Babylon, which was destroyed in 500 BC, approximately 500 BC. So just this passage had to have been fulfilled, in 500 BC, before Babylon fell. In another Old Testament example, this time a prophecy about the judgment of Egypt, God said, quote, "And when I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken the stars. I will cover the sun with the cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you, and will set darkness on your land when I make Egypt a desolation." So once again, the same, sun, moon, and stars growing dim language was used here. This prophecy was fulfilled about 580 BC. By the way, this, when these kind of passages talk about the sun, moon, and stars growing dim, it's a reference to the leaders of those nations, right? The sun, moon, and stars are a reference to the leaders of the nation, and when they're talked about falling or becoming dim, it just means that the leaders are going to be brought down. They're going to be taken out, basically. God's going to judge these leaders. So that's what these kinds of passages are referring to when they talk about the sun, moon, and stars growing dim or falling to the earth. Okay, so what about the coming on clouds language? This same kind of language was used in the Old Testament also. And let me give some examples of this. And remember, Jesus said that the Son of Man would come on clouds. Now, let me show that this too is typical apocalyptic language. In the Old Testament, for example, Isaiah 19 verse 1 says, "Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud, and he will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst." This is Isaiah 19 verse 1. So as the passage says, this cloud coming was a judgment against Egypt. And in fact, in the next chapter, Isaiah 20, it says God used Sargon, the king of Assyria, to carry it out. So this cloud coming happened in approximately 700 BC. In another example, Psalms 18 talks about God the Father's cloud coming. David says, or King David, I should say, says, quote, "God bowed the heavens also, and came down with darkness under his feet and thick clouds of the skies. For the brightness before him, his thick clouds passed with hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord thundered from heaven." This is Psalms 18, verses 7 to 17. So this cloud coming happened in approximately 1000 BC when God saved David from Saul. If you guys remember, Saul was chasing David all around Israel to try to kill him. So David described God saving him as a cloud coming. So this is the same kind of apocalyptic Jesus used to describe the judgment in AD 70. He said, the sun, moon, and stars will grow dim, and he talked about the Son of Man coming on clouds of judgment. So if it was not literal in the Old Testament, why would it all of a sudden be literal in the New Testament? After all, Jews wrote all these passages, and they never said to interpret their apocalyptic descriptions any differently in the New Testament than they had always interpreted it in the Old Testament. So there's no reason to believe that we should interpret it any differently. Keep in mind, though, that just because the apocalyptic language used to describe Jesus' second coming in AD 70 was not intended literally, this does not mean it was not an earth-shattering event. It absolutely was. As I noted, Jesus said that this would be the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be. And this is in Matthew 24, verse 21. And it was the greatest tribulation. The first century historian Josephus said that no other people had ever suffered such miseries from the beginning of the world. He said more than 1.1 million Jews were slaughtered. Another 97,000 were taken into slavery. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. I mean, it was a bloodbath for God's enemies. And besides the physical death aspect, the Jews also lost their privileged position before God. As Jesus said in the parable of the wicked vine dressers, the kingdom of God was taken away from Israel, or from Old Covenant Israel, and it was given to the church. And you can read about this in Matthew 21, verse 43. So this was a cataclysmic event for the Jews. In fact, Jews today still mourn about it 2,000 years later at the Wailing Wall. They're still mourning over this event. So just because the apocalyptic language used to describe the second coming was not intended literally, it was nevertheless an earth-shattering event. And it was a great event for God's people. After all, it vindicated that God was on the side of the Christians instead of the Jews who were persecuting the Christians. And it also was the time when sin was finally overcome. So man's relationship with God was finally restored. So this was a great event for God's people, but it was a, cataclysmic judgment for God's enemies. Okay, objection 3. How could the final judgment have happened in AD 70 when so many people had not even been born yet? My response is this. In the same way that Jesus in AD 33 sacrificed himself on the cross for believers of all time, past, present, and future. Jesus' atonement in the first century paid for the sins of all people, right? Past, present, and future. It was the same with the judgment in AD 70. Both had global impact that reached backwards and forwards in time. By the way, I talk more about this in my book, The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. It should be out in a couple weeks, so I discuss this topic, in detail in my book. So get that when it comes out. Another objection I want to discuss, if the judgment has already happened, then does this mean God will never again judge evil people or evil nations? Absolutely not. Just because the judgment foretold in the Bible has already happened does not mean God will never again judge evil people. In fact, if God's past actions are an indicator of his future actions, and they are, we can be pretty sure that God will continue judging evil people and nations. Even Hebrews talks about man is appointed once to die and then judgment. So, evil people are not going to get off the hook. The Bible teaches that God hates evil and will only tolerate it for so long before he judges it. Okay, so I don't think any of these kind of objections work. The events of AD 70 were no type or shadow. They were the fulfillment of the things that were prophesied about in the Old Testament. Okay, so that is it for today. For a more in-depth study of the topics discussed in this video, get my book, The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled, as I just mentioned a couple minutes ago. It should be available in bookstores everywhere in a couple weeks. I also have a bunch of free articles and videos on my website, thebiblefulfilled.com, so check those out if you're interested. If you like this video, by the way, please do me a favor, hit the like button. It'll make it easier for others to find on Google. And also, if you want to be notified of new videos, just hit the subscribe button. Okay, so that is it for today. Thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next week.